I have the pleasure today of introducing our speaker. We're very privileged and honored to have Miriam Sabin join us today. She is swinging through town for a conference and agreed to come out to our campus to give this talk. So we're very happy to welcome Miriam here. Miriam is the North American executive editor for The Lancet. She's been with the Lancet since 2020. Before that, she lived for 12 and a half years in Geneva, Switzerland, where she worked primarily at the World Health Organization and the Global Fund and UN AIDS, the UN AIDS. Prior to that, she was in the US Public Health Service at the CDC. She was in the EIS, the Epidemiologic Intelligence Service, and she was a senior research science officer in the Division of Viral Hepatitis and the Division of Global HIV/AIDS. She has lived all over the world, and she really leads the Lancet's work on global health. What she is going to speak to us today about is the more generic topic of what it's like to be an editor at the Lancet and how can we, as researchers, as scholars, as clinicians, as public health experts, get published in the Lancet and other high impact journals. So with that, welcome, Miriam, and thank you again for being here in Denver.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thanks. I'm really delighted to talk with all of you today about tips and tricks for publishing in high impact medical journals. So first of all, just, why are you in this profession is a very important question to ask yourself. And I love this answer. We make science for the benefit of humanity. And that comes across in your publications and in the work that you do, I think. I was at CROI this week in Denver. That's the main HIV scientific conference that happens every year. This was just a presentation that I snapped a picture of yesterday showing, this tremendous disparity in differences in the US for those who acquire HIV versus those who are less likely to acquire HIV. There's a lot of work to be done and a lot of good research that can go into answering the questions that then inform policy decisions, something that we're very interested in at the Lancet. So like this one. So thank you to Professor Winia, who was a Lancet commissioner on our recent Lancet Commission on Medicine, Nazism, and the Holocaust. This is not a typical research article. We have commissions where a group of experts get together and talk about what needs to happen to move a field forward. And he was involved in that, which is another important way that we try to make sure that we're moving towards the best science for better lives. So, but why publish? Well, share new findings, educate, express concern, encourage debate, to shed light on controversy, perhaps, to change practice, policy in the world, to entertain sometimes, to advance your career, let's be honest, incredibly important, right? And to keep your job, to get tenured as a professor, many, many different reasons. But I'm here to tell you actually that I think anyone can be published in a high impact medical journal. And I think that self-selection bias is oftentimes the biggest obstacle. I've talked to incredible researchers all over the world in different settings, and many people will say to me, well, it wouldn't occur to me that I could even submit a paper to the Lancet. Why would they want to take something from me? And don't select yourself out of that. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit. I'm saying tips and tricks, but really just knowing where your work fits is one of the most important areas that will help you be successful in high impact medical journals. But what are top journals looking for? Novel work? Is it new, or is this something that has been done many, many times and we're maybe only getting a little bit of interesting or new data out of it? Is it the first study, first in its field, first in class? Is it the last? Is it the end of the story? Is it practice changing? Does it challenge convention or dogma? We are interested also in largest data sets to date with different or definitive results to all other papers, a robust methodology, Not just positive results, but some negative results are very important, and we do publish those. So don't rule those out. If you think, this is an area where, say a particular practice or a particular recommendation is used in clinical practice, but it turns out that it's not really effective anymore, very important. We obviously look at clinical trials, large meta-analyses, that the topic is relevant to a large demographic, keeping in mind the whole world is not the United States. I will talk about this a little bit more, but unfortunately, I see a lot of papers come in where US researchers shoot themselves in the foot by talking as if the audience is only from the United States. It is very easy in an introduction to bring in other examples, to mention something about other countries and what they're dealing with. That's important. Certainly for us, we are a global journal with a global audience, and we're speaking to many people. So we don't necessarily like messages that are regionally or geographically limited, but this can vary. If it's something very important, for example, during COVID, we certainly published papers that were specific to the US, or if it's a very important issue, because we know, for example, in the United States, that a lot of the research that's done here, a lot of the policy decisions that are made here, including that Congress makes, affects decision-making in other parts of the world. And so we do look at that. So it's not to say that if it's a study only in the United States, we will not look at it, because that's not the case. We're also looking at, is it topical? Is it a right question at the right time? If we're getting so many papers, obviously that helps a lot to be able to have something topical. But ultimately, we're seeking research papers that will make a difference in clinical practice or could be policy changing. I'm going to give you some examples of that in a little bit. But where does my paper fit? So, and this was a question that came in earlier. It is okay to ask at the Lancet. Speaking for our journal, but I'm fairly certain also at JAMA and the New England Journal of Medicine, you can do the same thing, or other journals. If after you've done your homework on which journals you think might be the best fit, it's okay to email a pre-submission inquiry. I get these all the time. I am always very happy to answer them. I always answer them right away. If it's a major study, for example, a clinical trial, feel free to set up a time to talk. So I talk to researchers on the phone. They give me a call and we discuss it, so they get feedback right away. And stay in touch also about what you're working on afterwards. If you've published something, or you're working towards something that you think might be interesting in a few years, stay in touch. Seek out the editors who are interested also in supporting early career research. And I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So just a personal example, if we have some students and new researchers in the room. So actually my first article was published in JAMA, and I didn't really fully understand why that happened. And it was very career changing for me. There's no question about that. It was very helpful. It was the main results from my doctoral work. And I think some of the things in reflecting back on this were that you learn, it's so important to learn everything about your area of research. Be the expert in that area. What are the gaps in the knowledge? What hasn't been shown yet that needs to come to light, that needs to be out there in the literature? That's very helpful. What will your work contribute? Who are the smart and expert folks who can help you learn to be a better researcher and to communicate your results? This was back in 2003, a long time ago already. So in dissecting what appealed to JAMA, because it was so great, at a conference last year, I ran into the deputy editor at JAMA, and I said, I want to thank you because, you published this paper of mine. First of all, Annette Flanagan remembered the paper, what it was about, absolutely everything. It was really incredible. A wonderful woman and mentor. But they have a special issue every year on violence and human rights. And I thought, in really studying various medical journals, I thought, oh, that could be a good one. The area was not well known to US clinicians, but very relevant due to migration from Latin America. It was the end of the story. So the Guatemalan Mayan refugees had been living in refugee camps for 20 years, UNHCR camps, and they were going to close. There were disturbing results that clearly required action. And I brought on board two researchers from the CDC who worked in that area, and I got the United Nations on board. Yeah, as a graduate student, so I somehow decided to do this, and the study was well done and was written up well, and I had a lot of the support from the CDC researchers to do this. And so this is an example. Oh, actually, I should also just say, I was told by everybody, including my various mentors, no way was I going to be published in JAMA. They said, it'll never happen. Don't even waste your time submitting it. And I was also told, because I was going right into a tenure track position, it's going to take forever for it to be published. You need to start getting papers out. Well, guess what? I didn't listen to them, and I'm glad I didn't listen to them. And so here's a nice example. So during COVID in 2020, this is a viewpoint, so it's not a research article. I got a research article from these two women. There was another one. One was just in medical school. The others were new clinicians starting out in the field with a great paper that they wrote about from race-based to race-conscious medicine. And that viewpoint, it happened to come to me, and I thought, this is great. It's just what is needed. It's very topical right now. They were really among the first to get a very well-written paper out with hard-hitting recommendations. We published that paper, and I saw them at a Lancet 200th reception in New York in February. I invited them, and they told me that, it had completely changed their lives, and that they're considered, experts in this field of race conscious medicine, and they're speaking all over, the country now at medical schools. So just to say again, don't decide you can't do this. It can never hurt. Be in touch. And they have published subsequently in other Lancet journals as well. So just a nice example. Another nice example from last summer was I heard about a very interesting study that the World Health Organization was doing. And in this case, they also thought that there was no way the Lancet would be interested in this. I said, this is huge, which is part of my role to try to have a sense of what might, work at the Lancet. It was going to be linked to WHO new guidance, a policy brief, and WHO was going to have it come out at a major conference. That's also incredibly interesting, because if you can link your papers to important periods in time or other work that's going on, it helps. That's interesting to me, because I'm in this job because I want to see you get the maximum impact out of what you're doing. And if it's a very visible moment, that easily happens. And it was the biggest news of that conference, the IAS conference in Australia. But let's just go a little bit back to basics. So before you start, please read and follow the journal's advice to authors. I can't tell you how many times I've been working with authors, very seasoned authors, who still write to me and say, can you send me the link to the instructions for authors, or how many words are considered? And there's the thing called Google. It's there. I Google it all the time because I don't have it up on my computer. But it's important to know, because you can have a wonderful idea, but your paper comes in and it doesn't fit the format at all for the category you've submitted it for. And very often that will just be an automatic, we're going to transfer it. We're going to move it on. So don't let that happen to you. And if you have questions about it, then do write. Also, follow the appropriate reporting standards. There are many, and the Lancet, as with many major journals, have signed on to reporting guidelines for various types. So we get many times, I mean, even for clinical trials, we get clinical trials where the protocol, either we don't get the protocol or the protocol's been redacted and you can't read it, or you can't read parts of it, or you don't know if they've adhered to the consort guidelines for randomized trials. All of these pieces sort of, it doesn't help. You want to help yourself as much as possible by doing what is asked of you, so that, busy editors and certainly busy reviewers have what they need. We also have, just to say, this is important in terms of submissions. We have these fast track submissions. So this was actually the first article that came out on clinical features of patients during COVID, but we can turn around reviews in 48 hours. So it mostly works for randomized trials, but other papers of great interest, we can get papers out extremely quickly, reviewed quickly, and back out quickly. So that is one category to consider. But let me get behind the scenes just a little bit, because it's so interesting how different journals work. We're very unusual at our journal because we're all full-time editors, and we have some different processes. But the way it works for us is, well, and just to show you that there are actually 24 Lancet journals, and this becomes important, not just at the Lancet, but at any Springer Nature journal, the JAMA journals. All these journals now have like a family of journals empire, and that can be extremely helpful to you. Just to say that we also have basic science journals as well, and regional health journals. So we do have one for the Americas, and I many times get a paper at the Lancet that doesn't fit a global audience. It's perfect more for the US or regionally in the Americas, and it's going directly from the Lancet to Regional Health Americas, which is a great option. So basically what happens with us is you submit the paper. I get your paper, let's say it's a research paper. It's assigned in my queue. I read that paper. We read them within 2 days of getting them or so. We're very fast where we are, because again, we're full time. I am deciding if I should bring that for discussion in our pre-review meeting that we have. So it's a meeting we have before we where we decide if we're going to send a paper out for peer review or not. If I think that there's no way it's going to fit at the Lancet, or maybe not even a maybe, I am then suggesting a transfer for your paper. And I'm suggesting which Lancet journal might be a good fit. Many times, papers that are submitted to the Lancet are great fits for other top in their field Lancet journals: Lancet Oncology, Lancet Global Health, Lancet Infectious Diseases, Child and Adolescent Health, whatever it is. I am then sending it over to those editors to have a look at the paper. And that's where all those journals come in handy. They do that at JAMA too, and the other journals as well. And I think it really does increase your chances of being published in a high impact journal, even if it's not, the flagship Lancet or the flagship New England Journal of Medicine. So I may, that's is essentially the rejection. Or I may say, okay, this is a really interesting paper. I'm going to bring it and discuss it. And I am then discussing that paper. Everybody, all the Lancet weekly editors are weighing in on your paper. And the Lancet specialty editors, for the content that it's relevant, say it is a viral hepatitis paper, then our editors at Lancet Gastroenterology are going to be looking at that paper and weighing in on it as well. And at that meeting, then we're discussing whether we're going to send it out for peer review, or if perhaps another Lancet journal would be interested in it. If nobody's interested in it, then we suggest one of Elsevier's other journals. So you also, it sort of goes on there. That doesn't mean that your paper has to go to any of those, but you're given that option without having to resubmit the paper. So it can save a lot of time for you as an author, because various folks have already looked at your paper. Now, another thing I do, which I'll tell you is a little secret, is that pre-submission inquiry. So I had this last week, I spoke at Columbia, and someone from Columbia Medical Center wrote to me and they said, remember that thing I talked to you about? Well, I'm ready to submit it now. I've written it up. I'm not really sure. Will it fit in the Lancet? Maybe it'll fit somewhere else. Would you mind taking a look at it? I said, sure, great. And I said, I'm happy to, discuss this paper, and I'll get you the results back same day. And you'll know that day at our pre-review meeting, whether we're inviting you then to formally submit your paper, and I will send it out for peer review, or or I'm connecting you with another Lancet journal, or making a suggestion about another journal. So I'm very happy to do that. So basically, you can do that. You're having an answer that week from me, which is useful, I think. So what we do, just to explain also, still keeping on the slide, is that at the Lancet, we have 3 clinical reviewers. Not all journals have 3 clinical reviewers. We do, we're required to have that. And 1 dedicated statistical reviewer for all research papers. All research papers need a statistician to also look. Those reviewers make their, they do their reviews. I then bring the paper back to a Lancet journals wide meeting with all the journal editors present. We do that twice a week. I'm discussing what the peer reviewer said. I'm talking about what I think. All the editors are weighing in on a Microsoft OneNote about what they think. We're having a discussion there with the editor-in-chief about your paper. And I'm then getting back to you with either what our decision is, if we're going to keep the paper, or we would like you to revise your paper. And then you're getting all the various comments. I can say at the Lancet, getting through, well, I think first of all, getting through the first hurdle, going out for peer review, you've already massively increased your chances of being published at the Lancet or a Lancet specialty journal. And then if your paper does pretty well with peer reviewers, you're really usually in pretty good shape. And we have different systems for how we respond to the authors so that you can get a sense of where what we think about the paper and how it might go. So you're revising your paper often. There are a couple of revisions, and hopefully it is accepted. So then from that point, at post-acceptance, our production team takes over, and we're about in total around 200 people at all the Lancet journals. We have a big production team, and we have assistant editors who often are folks with PhDs and postdocs and significant experience, and they're the ones who go through your paper word for word. I'm not the one to do that. I read what they have done, but they go through it. They're checking everything makes sense. Well, it says this in the table, but it doesn't say this in the text. And, they're getting back to you. Some people complain that the Lancet is really a bit, I don't know, very strict about how we go through our papers, but it certainly gives me as the editor of your paper, tremendous confidence that your work is really been, improved, and that you're not going to have to write, there's not going to have to be an error or an errata published for it. We're trying to all avoid that because that's not fun when that happens. So it's sub-edited for clarity, conciseness, house style. It is British English, but they will change the English. You don't need to do that. From the US, they change it to that. And there's some, will to, I don't know, whilst and those sorts of tomato sorts of things. The illustrators also always redraw graphs, figures, and illustrations. And so we always need editable figures that can hold up papers if we don't have those. they are also checked for technical elements. We need all the conflicts of interest, reference formatting, just a real variety. Some of this has already been said. And I also just want to add in again, ignore the mean people in all throughout the process too. We've all had paper rejections. I don't think anybody is not, there's be something strange if you've never had a paper rejected. This is just a very funny sort of Twitter guy that I follow that just makes me laugh. And I just love, I'm afraid this manuscript may contribute not so much towards the field's advancement as much as towards its eventual demise. Oh, it's like, that's not nice. But I do have to say, at the Lancet, if you've got a reviewer who's saying that, I am not letting you see that. I'm reading what the reviewers have had to say, and someone is just blatantly mean. We're not going to take them back as a reviewer. It's not helpful. I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about research integrity. Obviously, this is hugely important. This is a Center for Bioethics, and wanted to discuss this, which is very relevant and topical. According to a Nature analysis recently, more than 14,000 papers were retracted in 2023, which is the highest number ever. More than 8,000 of those were linked to Hindawi, which is an open access publisher, and driven by what its owner at Wiley had called a large-scale systematic manipulation involving paper mills, reviewer mills, and fraudulent special issues. This is something that we're looking at very seriously because we're getting papers that are written by Chat GPT with falsified data. But we are actually saying you can use Chat GPT, you can use AI, but you must declare it that you've used it. We need to understand that you've used it. So it's about transparency. And we do have plagiarism detection software. Most of the time, we're not seeing plagiarism as much as we are seeing that authors have submitted a paper, say, to one Lancet journal. It was rejected there. They then submit it to another journal, but they think we don't know that it went to both journals. And so there's just no transparency. Don't do that. Be open about it. We also love if a paper, say, was rejected at the New England Journal of Medicine, the best practice is to tell us that and include the reviews and say, we addressed all the comments in those New England Journal reviewers' comments. We think the paper is much better now. And maybe very often New England Journal, they're like us, they're dealing with thousands of papers every year. And sometimes there's nothing wrong with your paper. It's just that they couldn't fit it in. We only have 3 slots a week for research papers. And so be transparent, be open about it, say we've addressed all this. We go and we look and we say, they did address all of this. This is great. You're much more likely to have us pick up a paper and work with it if you've been transparent than if you have not been transparent. We also now ask every author to sign off that they have had access to the data set, and I will explain why that is. Every author, as I said, has to fill out the declaration of interest form. And we also now have to ensure a couple of things. One, that if you're working with, say it's a secondary data analysis, perhaps a surveillance network or another network that we're not familiar with, and I'm familiar with most, it is, for example, like in the United States, we then get a reviewer who's familiar with that database, who knows that that database actually exists and what the pros and cons of it are, the strengths and weaknesses. We also, we recently had a paper submitted to us actually from United Nations colleagues about a couple of specific countries. Not one author was from any of those countries. And we said, we're very sorry. We're rejecting that paper. We're not taking it. You cannot tell us in this day and age that there are not authors from the Ministry of Health or for whatever important institution that could not have been on your paper. So it's also very much about trying to increase the equity of who's on papers and where in the list they're on them too, including looking at gender equity as well is quite important. And everybody has a part to play in this. Medical publishers do very much, and we're very involved in this. If I see a paper, that looks like helicopter research where people went in, did something in a community, didn't talk to anybody, got the data, said, we want to publish it. That's a bit of a strike against you. We want to see that you're doing best practices. Are you? And it does affect the quality of your research too. If you're doing research in an area where, say, you are not of that community, or it's a very specific topic, a specific health topic dealing with vulnerable populations, we want to know that you've consulted those communities, that you've put together research questions that actually make sense, that you have tried to validate those. So that's quite important. I'm just going to skip ahead here. I'm going to skip ahead as well. Just to say, you don't want to end up ultimately on Retraction Watch's website. I don't know if you know about Retraction Watch. It's really fascinating. They have their regular webpage, and they're also on X. And they are tracking, for transparency purposes, all the papers that are retracted and dealing with some of these issues. They're sort of a thorn in the side of a lot of the journals, I have to say. So we learned from a major retraction in 2020. You all might remember hydroxychloroquine and what happened there, and that it was taken up as, oh, this is going to be a wonderful treatment for COVID-19. It became a political issue. It still, unfortunately, sometimes comes up as a political issue. That was a paper in the Lancet. And some other researchers had looked at those results and said, these don't make any sense. Contacted our editor-in-chief. We put out an expression of concern and then wrote about it. Oops, sorry. I just wanted to talk about that. So because of the hydroxychloroquine study, this is where we've implemented having reviewers who know databases if they weren't known previously, because the guy basically made up the whole the whole surveillance network. They made up all the data, and the authors, the PIs, they had never seen the database, never had access to the database, because when we started requesting the data, guess what? It didn't exist. So we've had to put all of these other pieces in place. We can only do so much. We obviously have to have authors who are honest and caring, but we're trying to do this, and it's important to talk about it with all investigators, because the pressures are so great to publish. They're just so great, and institutions, academia needs to look at this as well. How can they help investigators and new investigators also, in particular, to not feel some of those perverse incentives that encourage not great practices. Ultimately, really kind of in closing, I just wanted to say that you should study hard what interests you the most in the most undisciplined, irreverent, and original manner possible, because again, that's the most important thing. Do the research that really you find compelling, that stands out. Chances are others may not have thought about it or looked at it in the way you have. You'll be answering a question that's important, and we feel that enthusiasm very much. We feel it in the cover letter, the excitement about the subject, and that helps as well. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your questions now. Thanks. If there's any, I think there's some questions from online. Well, I do have some here that I was given from online initially. I could start with that if you think that's a good idea. Okay, we had a question about, are there different probabilities of getting accepted for different topics or types of articles? For example, brief reports or case studies than others. So that's That's a very good question. I think that, well, first of all, we don't publish case studies in the Lancet, so that's number one. We tend not to do that, and that is because, again, it's not generalizable. And unfortunately, in this climate where the clinical decisions are made sometimes for political reasons, it can be very tricky to publish a one-off case study or a case series that's less than 5 patients. If you're an informed reader, you know what the limitations are of that. But unfortunately, the media doesn't necessarily, and the U.S. Congress doesn't necessarily, and so we saw this a lot during COVID-19. So it becomes quite important. Now, in terms of probability, this is interesting because research papers, I think there's a lot more competition, of course, but comments. We have something called viewpoints, which are 1,400 words with some hard-hitting recommendations. Viewpoints do go out for peer review. Comments don't. And some long forms of correspondence can be quite easy to get published if you contact the editor, if you've got something highly topical, important, you've got a new take on it. So in other words, we haven't been reading it in the New York Times every day, or the Atlantic, the same sort of point of view. You've got something new and novel to say. It's very specific to health, to a global audience. That's the kind of thing you can reach out to me and say, do you think this might make a good comment or a viewpoint? And that's a very nice way too to have a publication in a Lancet journal or JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine, if you are not in a position to submit a research paper for a period of time. You're not it is obviously different in terms of how your university may look at it, a research paper versus a comment or so forth. But with your colleagues, in terms of yourself in the field, building expertise, building a network, it can be quite useful. So I'm always happy to talk to folks about that. I can answer another question now too. So, are there things to avoid when trying to pitch bioethics work? So we actually we do get some bioethics work from time to time. Interestingly, they tend to be from the same few bioethicists. And they're often very, very big names in the field. That's not why they're getting published. I think they just, are writing all the time, and it's very topical, or they have a lot of folks working for them and they're able to, get this work out fast. But I would say, again, it has to do with the topical nature of it and the novelty. If this is a subject with a new angle, like that race conscious medicine, for example, that's not bioethics per se, but in terms of the novelty, we are looking at it. It doesn't matter who you are or where you've come from. We're judging it the same as everything else. And frankly, I would love to see new voices. And this speaks to the issue again of people thinking that the Lancet or Lancet journals aren't going to be interested. You know, I would love to see papers that are not from Ivy League universities. The Ivy Leagues have, major powerhouses helping them to submit papers to major journals. They have major randomized clinical trials they're in charge of and all of that. But I'm a state university person. I went undergraduate to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, actually, and I one of the reasons why I think it's so important to come to places and like as I'm doing today is to let folks know that don't rule yourself out because of that. In fact, I'm eager to get contact from places where we don't get as much. That's quite important. I don't know if you want to ask. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. So the question was, what proportion of manuscripts that originally come in are eventually accepted? So at the main Lancet, it's I think 9%. It's a very small proportion, but that doesn't answer how many then get accepted in another Lancet journal. So, and actually that would be a great statistic for me to have off the top of my head. It doesn't. I mean, I don't, but to say so that it doesn't sound so encouraging, the majority of papers we get, probably 90% of the papers we get, are just not a good fit. They're not the right fit for a general medical journal or for a particular audience. Or the cover letter says, dear British Medical Journal, we really want you to get this paper. These sorts of things happen all the time. So if you make it to that peer review stage, it's already quite big. But we had a question in the audience too. Yes.
So I'm a little curious, what's the best way for, in your mind, for someone to kind of begin the relationship? So I think for me, it was sort of transferred from a colleague who said, hey, have lunch with this editor. You're great, you should know each other. And we were at the same meeting, but is it email? Is it asking, an editor section where I try to publish a lot? What's the best way for people to kind of get started?
Yeah, so this was a great question about from a new career researcher. In terms of meeting editors, what's the best way to get started and connecting with them? And she was saying that she's had that really good experience with one editor already, and I'm the second person to say this, so maybe it's actually true. Maybe it's true. So it can be done many ways. First of all, I'm always happy to just get like a cold call email, not an actual cold call, because I don't like talking on the phone so much unless I have to. But you can email me. That's me. I don't know that that's every editor. Put something interesting in the subject line. It's important because people get so much mail. I think that helps. Or another way is to have someone. I had this last week. A colleague of mine from WHO knew somebody at another university in the US who had done some really interesting work. He wrote to me first and said, hey, would you be willing to talk to so-and-so about this study and see if it might be appropriate for the Lancet? That worked out great. That paper's going out for peer review, actually. But this week at CROI, where at this conference that I was at, I happened to hear about someone's work out at UC San Diego, and I was interested in it. And I wrote to her and said, hey, your work is so interesting. I'd love to talk to you about it sometime. I think it's going to be really, of interest, maybe even 2 years from now, 3 years from now. I'd love to hear what you're doing. We met at CROI for coffee. And so, but I think probably the best way out of all of that is to have someone maybe make that connection, like you've said, is a good way to do it. Yeah. Yeah. Would you like to? So we have a question about where a paper is initially rejected, but the deputy editor at that specific journal said, it was an interesting paper. Why don't you resubmit it and submit it under a different category? So at the Lancet, we call that an encouraging reject. And that's where we think a paper's really interesting. They've got, it was a great study or an interesting kernel, but it wasn't necessarily right or the right format. We will go back to those authors. We don't do it very often with an encouraging reject, which means that the editor, I would say, be writing to you, telling you all this, asking you, if you make these changes, we'd be happy to look at it again. And then you do send it in as a new submission. So it's very similar. But I do want to say something connected to that related to the format of papers, because that is another area where papers are outright rejected. Often, very quickly, if you have submitted, say, a viewpoint and it's just 5 times too long. And I'm saying this because I see this a lot. It's 5 times too long. You didn't read the instructions for authors. It's a lot of work. So if it's not a really novel, interesting, important piece, you're not going to have editors get on board with wanting to help you, rework that paper. That's just not going to happen. That's for you and your colleagues and co-authors and mentors to do. So getting the format right is so important. And if you are not sure what that format is, write and ask. Yeah. Yeah, the impact factor. It's so funny because we all love to say we don't care about the impact factor. But at the same time, I'm more than happy to say that the Lancet beat the New England Journal the last 2 years, and we're #1 and we're not #2 again. So, having been a researcher myself, obviously it is important. But there's a holistic way to look at it. It's not just about the number of citations, for example, connected to your paper. It could be also, taking into account some of these other alt metrics. So was there discussion around the paper? Did the media pick it up? Was there a piece on NPR about it? And looking at that also over time, because impact factor is very tricky. If you have a paper out, unless it's a major blockbuster study, you're not going to really have a sense of where that paper really sits in your field. Maybe for a few years, you don't really know. So, but yes, obviously, what we want papers that are going to lead to better science, that are going to be practice changing. It should align ideally with the impact factor, but it doesn't necessarily. So we're not looking at your paper in terms of, oh, we think that one's going to get a lot of citations. I mean, I can say at the Lancet, we don't do that. We're looking at it in terms of the science, the quality, again, the topical nature. Does it answer a question? Does it change something that's dangerous for patients or that helps them live longer? Actually, on that, I want to say for clinical trials, one of the reasons why clinical trials are often rejected at our main Lancet is because it's not the right primary endpoint. It's not an endpoint that may ultimately lead to a difference in mortality for patients, for example. If it's a very sort of soft endpoint, then it may just, we hear this a lot, this is sort of incremental. It may lead to some additional knowledge, but it's not quite enough, as compared with all of the other, clinical trials that we're getting. Yeah. We have another 5 minutes even, so yeah. Yeah, this is a question about reviewers and what we do with some reviewers who are not particularly nice. Do we have a chat with them or not? So actually, for our statistical reviewers, because we have a statistical pool, those reviewers are, we use them regularly. We would have a chat with them if we think they're being too harsh with people. I mean, that has happened. If they continue to be that way, then we remove them from the pool. For regular peer editors, if someone is particularly nasty, yes, you might very well get an email from me saying this was really out of line. And now, whether I would decide then to put them on the no peer review list, that's something else, but that can happen as well. We do have that, but we also have that for authors. And I should say that when you submit your revision, you do, it's always better, even if you despise what the reviewer said and what the editor said, and you don't like any of us, it's best not to have that come across. It's just not helpful, but you'd be surprised. It happens. It really, really does happen. But it's better if you don't agree with what the reviewer said, you can reach out to me as the editor and say, I don't agree with this. Can I explain to you why we did it this way? And then very often, I might say, okay, I think that sounds all right. And we proceed, but don't shut down the conversation and your chances there. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, this was a question about kind of content that the Lancet publishes, and this faculty member had the impression that we mostly publish basic science as opposed to clinical science. And it depends on the journal. So for the main Lancet, we're publishing clinical science. We have eBiomedicine, which is a basic science journal. Lancet Microbe is a little basic sciencey, but in general, we are publishing clinical science. It's about clinical medicine, clinical practice. Yeah. So with one more minute, are there any other burning questions at all? Yeah, sure. Let's take one more question from the chat then. Mm. That's a good question about if we take theoretical ethics papers or if they have to have empirical justifications. We can definitely look at something that's theoretical. But I think it would probably be good to have a conversation with an editor, make that pre-submission inquiry first on it. And the other thing I would say is when you're writing that pre-submission inquiry, talk a little bit about what has already been written about perhaps in that area and where your piece would fit in. One thing I didn't mention is, and this actually separately applies to our research studies, we have these research and context panels, which are really important because they tell us very quickly where your paper sits. Is this the first time something's been done, or what do we know about that research area already? What does this add? What does your paper add to it? Those kinds of discussions are very useful, in particular for busy editors who are going and pitching your paper to the other editors and making a case for your paper. We can very often, take what you have said and really use that to make our argument, to make our case. Yeah. And I think it's 1 o'clock. I think we're at time. So I would just say, for all of you, please, I think you had my email address. It's m.sabin@lancet.com. It's also on the website. And please do stay in touch. And it's been really a pleasure to be here, be with all of you. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very insightful.